We are back, and we are joined now once again by Raga Makawi, Sudanese editor, researcher, editor of the Pan-African platform African Arguments. Raga, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So it's been just over 1 year since this bloody war in Sudan erupted. Can you give our audience a quick overview of what the current status is and what the sides are here in this latest conflict?
Sure. So Sudan's conflict, Sudan's war, remains a widespread phenomena that's affected every aspect of Sudanese life. The actual fighting spreads across the country, even though it's disappropriately kind of focused, more intense in some areas more than others. More recently, the conflict has taken on an ethnic kind of dimension, especially with its epicenter recently developing in Darfur. I mean, you've had the whole kind of ethnic cleansing of the Masalid groups, the black tribes in West Darfur back in July, as the RSF pushed them into Chad and murdered hundreds, if not more. Now you've got kind of a repeat of that situation where it's a standoff in Darfur's capital, where you've got the RSF, a standoff between the RSF and SAF, with the kind of with the presence of multiple rebel groups whose base has always been the capital of Darfur. So you've got this situation where the conflict has drawn in rebel fighters of different ethnic groups, armed actors of ethnic backgrounds, and they're all kind of in a standoff now in Fasher. The problem is Fasher itself has been a haven that received multiple displaced population from around Darfur and other areas. But at the moment, the probability of its implosion into a war zone that affects millions of already displaced is quite acute. The ethnic element of that is also quite prominent. If you have a situation where different rebel groups of different ethnic backgrounds who have been in conflict over the past 20 years since the Darfur War first erupted in 2004, if you have them again clashing over kind of a political agenda turned ethnic, then that's a catastrophe in the making. I think it's also important to kind of consider what the violence, the shape the violence has taken on over a year, as you said, Emma. It had social and economic implications. More than 30 million people in Sudan are now food insecure. You've got a famine that's looming. It's not declared, but its palpable effects are felt. So the fact that this is a countrywide conflict with no safe havens means that people's livelihoods, the existing kind of economic chains and the markets that have existed have all been disrupted, destroyed. People have no access to food. Obviously, not to mention the kind of directed violence at the populations. Really problematic stories emerging of the directed and targeted the targeting of public, the unarmed public, using anything from rape as a weapon of war to kind of extrajudicial killings. All of this has also kind of necessitated a reaction on the part of the public. More and more kind of civilian Sudanese are taking up arms to protect themselves, to protect their families. So now you've got a situation where more and more people are kind of being drawn into the fold of the conflict, which warns of the probability of this turning into a civil war.
And you mentioned the RSF. Hemedi is the leader of the RSF. Can you give us some background on what the RSF is? And it's basically the fact that it's butted heads with traditional armed forces in Sudan.
Right. So the RSF is a paramilitary or kind of militia group that was created by the Sudanese government, particularly under the tenor of the Islamists under Bashir's and as part of Bashir's regime, in order to be able to control the periphery. So their formula to kind of ensuring their control over places like Darfur and Kordofan that had a presence of rebel movements was to kind of arm ethnic groups, ethnic tribes, and have them fight the fight on behalf of the state. So it was, as I explained previously, it was a counterinsurgency on the cheap tactics. So kind of export armed contracts or export violence contracts out to ethnic groups to be able to do what the state did not manage to do for the last 30, 40 years. Now, Hemeti himself has grown in his prominent, he's become quite a prominent kind of armed actor first in Darfur, and then his weight, the magnitude of his both political and armed weight has increased with time, mostly because of developments that have to do with Sudan in itself. I mean, Sudan has gone through a revolution. When the revolution erupted in Khartoum, in the capital, in 2018, Bashir and his regime had to then rely on the RSF, on Hemeti, to also quell political unrest in the center. So they brought them over. They expanded their mandates. They constitutionally legitimized them through a decree and some legal provisions. That's on one side. On the other side, the political, economic, and violence turmoil that the Horn in general and beyond is dealing with necessitates, armed actors who are mercenaries, who can be paid off. So you've had regional actors, particularly the UAE, pay for these kind of, for these services in a kind of gun for hire kind of model or style. So all this money coming from the legitimacy, legal and political legitimacy from the inside, financial clout from the outside, has given ground and unprecedented growth to the concept of militias in Sudan as not seen elsewhere.
And is that why I've seen reporting that Iran is also giving funds, and to the other side, is that a part of this as well?
Well, I mean, not directly, but again, this is kind of a wider dynamic of how the Sudanese state is trying to kind of legitimate itself and balance out its ability to kind of take back monopoly over violence. Iran is a long-term kind of ally of the Sudanese state, despite kind of a break in relations in the last 10 or 15 years. So it's part of a kind of an extended network of allyship that the Sudanese state kind of reverts to when it needs. And you see it with countries like Turkey, for example. It's not just Iran. But right. The Sudanese state is in desperate need. I mean, the Sudanese army is in desperate need of weapons, financial support, and it will turn to whomever will provide this for it.
Because I read some of your writing essentially saying that the RSF had made a lot of gains and early on, and that's stalled a bit. But I want to get to that in a second, the reality on the ground, as you'd been alluding to before. But you mentioned the 2018-2019 revolution, and there was a glimmer of hope and a beginning of potentially a new future for Sudan. What happened there? How did that break down? And then how did the RSF, you mentioned how they grew in power because the state deployed them to quell down this uprising. But how does the history of like the populist movement of people rising up against the government fit into this?
Thank you for asking about the revolution. I think it's an important and usually overlooked aspect of the political dynamic in Sudan, even though it's a central, it's got quite an impact, and it's a central feature of it. I think that the way that Bashir was ousted, the kind of conditions that kind of saw his being deposed were ones that were internally manufactured. So it was more or less a palace coup. And even though Bashir left, his political security establishment remained intact. And we saw that in the aftermath. So basically, the process that developed in the aftermath of Bashir being ousted was quite problematic. And this is why the Sudanese popular movement never went back home. They continued to protest on the street because they realized that, you know, this new introduced formula that was unfortunately backed by Western powers was not going to deliver them towards a transition into a democracy. The main players on the stage, or that had inherited Bashir's military security system, were none other than Hemeti, together with the Sudanese armed forces. And yes, eventually they did kind of bring in some civilian actors, but their presence, their role, their weight in kind of shifting the political dynamics was very minimal. And the consequences seen in the, you know, in what happened after that. A coup to only 2 years after Bashir was ousted, followed by a countrywide war.
And that coup basically gave rise to the two actors that we're seeing here, who are responsible for the violence, Hemeti and Burhan. Can you speak about his forces as like the skeleton of the Sudanese army and what that means kind of going forward?
As I mentioned before, the Sudanese army itself was weakened over the decades since independence, so since post-independence. The Sudanese army, even though it's a central actor and economic agent of Sudanese politics, it's been weakened by neoliberal politics, you know, by austerities, by American sanctions. And so the Sudanese state devised this measure of developing and arming agents or actors on its behalf in the areas it can't reach most. And Sudan's formula, like most post-colonial countries or African countries, is where the periphery or the rural areas usually kind of feed the center. So the center depends on its, you know, kind of continuance on the periphery. So that's where you got the land, that's where you got the livestock, that's where you got cheap labor. In order to control all of that and to ensure that a revolution doesn't erupt from the periphery, the Sudanese state, you know, devised a mechanism or a governance model by which it rules through kind of conflict, security, and war through a proxy. Now, eventually, the role of these armed actors kind of developed beyond kind of meting out violence to also managing to becoming a proxy bureaucratic arm of the state. Members of the RSF or groups of the RSF were kind of involved directly in the managing of Sudan's productive sectors, whether it was in the mechanized Jazeera scheme, which is the near periphery, just outside of Khartoum. They were also in charge of controlling land and governing mining sites. They oversaw the process of extracting gold, its movement to Khartoum, so it can be exported to the Gulf after that. They also oversaw the process of securing livestock routes, which is by far Sudan's largest export commodity. So again, the vitality of armed actors or paramilitary armed actors in Sudan is not just about violence, but it kind of tells the story of the intertwinement of both economic production or money and violence, the necessity of violence and armed actors for economic extraction, which the state needs to maintain itself.
We put up this map here just so people can visualize, because I think sometimes it's hard to get a full sense of the geography here. You see Darfur at the bottom, and this is that's the north. Khartoum is there in the center, as has been referenced here. Last question, Raga, before I know we have to let you go. What do you think that the Western audiences are missing? And the Western press, I know they miss a ton if they don't give the context of, say, the 2018 or 2019 revolution and how people are trying to take back their government and put something more equitable in place. But what would you say to our, English speaking audience that they should keep in mind when analyzing the horror that's happening in Sudan?
I mean, for starters, I think the way that Sudan is referred to, or the war that the Sudanese war being referred to as the forgotten war, is somewhat of a problematic kind of reference. Mostly because it kind of suggests, first of all, it overlooks the fact that it is not normal in this day and time for a war at this level and this magnitude to erupt and also maintain its intensity over a year. I think people, especially in the West, asking the question, what is the war in Sudan? Yes, there's a war, but what is this war? What does it look like? What are the driving forces behind it? How has it managed to maintain its intensity for this long? Is as equal as remembering that there is a war in Sudan that requires humanitarian assistance. I think that the West, and particularly America, they could do more to intervene at a geopolitical level to stem the problematic interventions of regional countries who are influencing and driving this war, either through funding, funding of militias or political meddling. I think that countries in and within themselves, communities do have the ability to reconcile, to stem the violence, to kind of kickstart a process of peace and then post-war reconstruction. And what's stopping it is these kind of meddling and interventionist activities coming in from rogue and problematic agents or countries in the region. I think the West should play a more active role in stemming these negative or problematic politics.
All right. Well, Raga Makawi, Sudanese editor, researcher, editor of the website and Pan-African platform magazine, African Arguments. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for having me. Bye now.
Of course.